Today we'll have a look at the Anglo-Saxon world and Beowulf. First of all, we know that the Roman Empire was present in England for about 400 years, and in 410 it was obliged to withdraw from Britain to go and help Rome protect themselves against the invasion of the barbarians, as we call them. Uh, Naturally, when they left Britain, Britain was not protected anymore, so it was easy for new invaders to come to Britain. And the first ones came from the Northern Sea, what we generally call the German tribes, in particular the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jews. Naturally, they brought with them their language, this old Germanic language, that we generally call the Anglo-Saxon language, or in other words, the Old English. There were two maybe important causes that gave rise to what we generally call the birth of English literature. And this was the invasion, the Anglo-Saxon invasion, and the spread of Christianity. Try to understand why also Christianity was important in giving rise to this important element that was literature. Well, towards the end of the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great was interested in the Christianization of Britannia, as the Romans had called it, and its inhabitants that were called the Britons. So we can say that they were sent, monks were sent there to help with this important scope, but in particular Augustine that built also a church in Canterbury, thus becoming the first archbishop, in fact, in Canterbury. The inhabitants that were there when the Anglo-Saxon arrived, or the Roman Britons, as we call them, were pushed towards the west, westwards towards what we call now Wales, over the mountains, so there was a kind of natural protection against the invaders. And in some way they kept their Christian faith before the coming of these new monks that helped in the Christianization of the rest of Britain. And it is here that comes out the famous legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. In fact, they were there to fight, to defend their culture, and against the new invaders that were the Anglo-Saxons. The coming of the monks, the presence of the monks, and the presence of Latin before and afterwards with the Christianization and the building of many monasteries in some way helped people to keep written documents regarding what was happening in England in those times, as also literature in some way had an important role in this reconstruction. So historical documents are important because most of them were written in Latin in the monasteries. And one of the most important that reminds us of the important events that took place in that period was written by the Venerable Bede. That was a story of the English people. Beowulf. Beowulf is an epic poem written in maybe the first, or without maybe, the first poem written in the English language, the Old English language that we generally call Anglo-Saxon language or the Old English. Actually, it was not written in Britain, it was brought with the invaders from their tradition and culture. So we can say that it's part of the oral tradition. Oral tradition means that the the elements, the poetry, the poem itself was passed by word of mouth from generation to generation. Now, Beowulf is as we said, an epic poem that exalts the qualities of the warriors of the time. And these qualities you may quite well understand as battles and war, or the first role of the warriors of the time was bravery and heroism. Most of all, in fact, Beowulf is a warrior story. It talks about the hero, Beowulf, that fights against a monster that was called Grendel. Now, Beowulf was king in the southern part of Sweden, and he answered the request of help by King Hrothgar of Jutland, which had some problems with the monster, which was killing most of his warriors and inhabitants. So Beowulf manages to kill the monster, and in a second moment also its mother, bringing a kind of peace and wealth to the country. It is important to underline which are the main themes that most of all are themes that are characteristics of quite all epic poems in other cultures. We have seen the importance of the hero. Well, the qualities of a good leader are fundamental to highlight how they manage to be a referring point in that particular moment. So the heroism of the leader, mostly also the moral qualities of its leader, and the virtues that should be important to be a referring point for the community of which he was a leader. Supernatural elements are quite always present there, because as we may well understand, not all things had a rational explanation, and so the presence of the supernatural was a normal element in the epic poems of the time. And specifically, we tend to point out as a third point always the struggle between good and evil, where in this particular case Beowulf represents the good and Grendel and its mother the evil side. We have also some Christian elements and values that undergo the lines of Beowulf. Naturally, as it was written in the 9th century in the monasteries, it's quite normal that maybe some of the monks put in some of the Christian elements that refer to the presence of God. Beowulf is a very strong poem, strong in the sense that it has a kind of violent characteristic in its events, and naturally also in the language used to describe these elements. And it's because of the nature of language in itself. In fact, the Anglo-Saxon is a language full of consonants, and this hard sound that you find produce actually a violent effect, a hard effect. That is a characteristic naturally of a language describing war and heroism. From a formal point of view, we can say that it is organized in the presence of stresses and alliteration. Okay, the line in Beowulf is divided in two halves, divided by a break, or what we call a caesura. Okay, and in each line we have 4 stresses. Sometimes in the same line we have what we call a rhyme. In this particular case, it is called an internal rhyme. But we referred also to alliteration. Alliteration is nothing else but the repetition of the same consonantal sound at the beginning of a word. Okay. The alliteration at the beginning gives a certain rhythm to the line, and it has also a linking role between the different words. Another element to consider is that the Anglo-Saxon is a language poor in vocabulary. It was at the beginning, so it did not have all those elements that characterize a high-level language apt for the great literature. So sometimes the poets or those who invented new lines or retalking were obliged to put together two words to form a new one, when they did not have a word to describe an event or even an object. We call this a compound metaphor, or other words, a kenning. A kenning, so, is the compound of two words forming a new one. For example, if they wanted to talk about the sun, they call it a sky candle. Or if they wanted to talk about the sea, they called it the whale road. Very poetic from this point of view. To complete our brief discussion, in 1938-39, just before the Second World War, there was an important discovery in the region of Suffolk, where they found a burial ship of the times of the Anglo-Saxon, what we call the Saturn Who. And the Saturn Who helmet that we generally find in all literature books when they speak about Anglo-Saxons and the Beowulf is now present in the British Museum, where you can have a look and see some of the treasures that we'll find in this burial ship of Saturn Who.